welcome everyone. All right, so welcome everyone to our Friday NIST Falcon session. And we are excited today to welcome Melinda Owens, Dr. Melinda Owens from University of California at San Diego. Melinda was originally trained as a neuroscientist and obtained her PhD in neuroscience from UCSF. But during her graduate training, she learned about scientific teaching and fell in love with the idea that teaching could be studied scientifically. After being a lecturer and developing her teaching skills at Cal State East Bay and Stanford, she decided to return to research in biology education. And that's actually where our paths crossed at San Francisco State, where she did a postdoc with Kimberly Tanner. And she's currently a tenure track assistant teaching professor at UCSD in the Department of Neurobiology. And her research kind of falls into two categories. One is how do college instructors teach? And the second is how do college students think about biology? And in looking at how instructors teach, Melinda was actually very instrumental in developing the DART tool, which is the Decibel Analysis for Research and Teaching, which is a software tool that can analyze classroom audio recordings to assess the time that's spent using certain types of teaching strategies. And so DART can be used to investigate a variety of questions to help understand how instructors teach and to promote evidence-based teaching. But what Melinda's going to talk to us about today has more to do with the other half of her research, which is about how students think. And students, we all know, students learn more effectively when their instructors know kind of what ideas students already have. And in particular, previous studies have shown that students, a lot of students, as we've seen in the chat, have misconceptions that prevent them from developing expertise in whatever discipline. And many of the student misconceptions that they have are rooted in ways of intuitive thinking that are kind of predate modern scientific thought. And so today, Melinda's going to tell us a little more about her research into uncovering misconceptions and alternative conceptions that students might have, and how we can learn how to do that in our classrooms so that we can be better instructors. So take it away, Melinda. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to have you here.
All right, thank you. I'm really excited to present my work today. So I just want to say probably the strangest misconception I've encountered. I was co-teaching a course, and the other lecturer mentioned climate change, and one of the effects of climate change is that, you know, islands will get flooded. And a student comes, actually two students come up after class and they're like, we don't understand the island thing. Don't islands float? They were very excited to learn that islands do not in fact float. They like went back and yelled to the rest of their group, look, islands don't float. But anyway, so that's probably mine. All right. So yeah, and thank you for sharing the misconceptions. So we've seen that there's quite a variety of ideas that students come up with. So what do we mean by the term misconception? So the broadest meaning that people use is just scientifically inaccurate idea. And that's the meaning I'm going to use today. Some people have a more restrictive definition of the word misconception. It has to be an idea that's, well, wrong, but also coherent and kind of deeply seated. So for example, the idea that we only use 10% of our brains is wrong, but it's not like tied into other ideas. It's not part of like a bigger framework, and it's not so deeply seated. Like I think if someone didn't just make this up at some point, I don't know why people would believe it. And then you tell people it's not true and they're like, okay, fine, it's not true. In contrast, some other ideas, misconceptions, for example, about evolution, for example, the idea that like a lot of people think that evolution happens because organisms want something and they kind of grow that way. Like giraffes want to reach those higher leaves, and they grow tall. And that's wrong. But it also fits in with like other things that are often true, like when the way people accomplish goals, for example, is by having a goal and doing things to accomplish that. So they it kind of fits in that maybe they think animals and the natural world is the same way, and it's deeply seated. It's really, even if you teach somebody the true thing, it's kind of hard to get rid of some of these ideas. In this presentation, we're not going to make too much of that distinction. So I'll just be using the terms alternative conception or scientifically inaccurate idea to describe these kinds of wrong ideas. So I'm just curious to know what you all think. Where do you think alternative conceptions in our students come from? Maybe go ahead and put that in the chat. And I do want to say there's many good answers to this question. There's many places where alternative conceptions come from. Yeah, awesome. Thank you. So I'm seeing some kind of common themes here. One is that they heard it from somebody, from friends, from their families, from oral traditions, their community, or people that they respect. I'm seeing they kind of half read something or learned something in school, but not completely or correctly. They're trying to logic things out, but maybe they don't have the whole story. Their intuition, their observations of the world, and maybe sometimes correct inferences and sometimes not correct inferences. So yeah, I agree. So yeah, many sources, as you've said, media, friends, family. Sometimes we are guilty, or previous instructors are guilty of instilling some alternative ideas, or maybe we try to teach something and the students misremember it. I also teach intro biology, and we talk about chemical bonds, and sometimes a lot of students actually will say to me, "Oh, hydrogen bonds are the strongest." That's what my chemistry teacher said. And actually, I'm like, okay, well, maybe you didn't remember the second half of that sentence, which was that hydrogen bonds are the strongest intermolecular force. And then I explained to them, well, they're not stronger than a covalent bond. Intuitive thinking. So yes, I think somebody mentioned this as well. So models of the world that usually work but aren't totally accurate, like the evolution example I gave. There's many kind of ideas like that. Also in physics, like ideas that like you throw a ball and it goes in a semicircle, not a parabola. So, okay. And then, yeah, genuine attempts to kind of logically understand the world or the material, but not quite getting there. So yeah, one thing I want to emphasize from this is that alternative conceptions are really inevitable. It doesn't matter what you've taught or what you teach. Students have probably been exposed to this topic in some way, hearing it from somebody, reading about it, but quite possibly in some maybe incomplete way or not quite correct way. So they're coming in with these ideas about what we're teaching. And also, students have overall ideas about how the world works in general that may or may not be accurate when applied to your topic. And so, for example, I study ideas about vaccines. So some students have, there's just the general idea that we should avoid putting nasty things in our bodies. That's a perfectly reasonable idea, right? But you know, then they don't quite understand that, like, oh, not everything artificial is bad. Not everything that's a chemical is bad. And so you know, when it gets applied to vaccines, it doesn't quite get translated correctly. And then most important to remember is this, that students construct new knowledge out of their existing prior knowledge. So, right, that's called constructivism. And so when we teach, we have to think, okay, students have this knowledge. It's incomplete, it's partial, it's not quite correct. When we teach them stuff, it's not replaced. They are trying to wrestle with how this new knowledge fits in with their old knowledge. And so the old knowledge is not replaced, it's built upon or transformed into new ideas and a new understanding. And hopefully the new understanding is more correct. But it may not be. Often that transformation is not very smooth. But it's also important to address these alternative conceptions. So you might think like, oh, I teach something and I give an exam and they circle the right answer on the exam. Or they write down the right formula, you know. Well, that's not enough, because students can simultaneously hold accurate and inaccurate ideas. And what that means is that they might give you an accurate answer on a test, but when it comes to maybe applying things to their real world, or to a different situation, or if you ask the question in a different way, they're giving inaccurate information. So this has been studied quite a bit in physics, actually, where they found that students who can use formulas very well to calculate, okay, you throw a ball, where is it going to be in its trajectory? You know, how far is it going to go? But then you ask them, okay, well, what shape does it make? And they give the wrong idea. So, you know, students can have a disconnect between kind of this school knowledge that might be accurate and what they really believe or what they use to solve problems. And that's a problem, right? Like we want people to have knowledge, not only to give to us on tests, but to be useful in their world and to build upon correctly for their future endeavors. Other things is some alternative conceptions really hinder the acquisition of accurate knowledge. And so, for example, if you don't understand evolution very well, if you think that it is kind of striving towards a goal, there's a lot of things about kind of the field of evolution and biology that don't make sense. Like, why would you ever have mutations, for example, and the role of mutations? Why is there variation between organisms? So a lot of that doesn't make sense if you have kind of a broad misconceptive worldview about certain topics. But I do want to say this is complicated. In some cases, alternative conceptions can be a waypoint to more accurate ideas. So sometimes you start with something pretty inaccurate and you get something sort of inaccurate and you can build there to accurate knowledge. So you have to be careful there. So you have to think about these misconceptions and kind of how bad they are and how much truth they have in them. Empirically, as Brenda alluded to, students learn more when their students understand what ideas, what alternative conceptions their students hold. So this was a series of studies actually that asked students or asked teachers both, like they gave them like a knowledge test to see what they knew, and they also gave the same test, but they asked, what would your students choose as the correct answer? And it turns out that teachers who understood what their students chose would choose. They also gave it to the students to confirm that. were more effective teachers. And that ability to predict what students would say was more predictive of student learning gains than the teacher's own knowledge. And that's because once you understand what your students know, you can address those alternative conceptions. You can, emphasize the accurate knowledge that's most important for combating those alternative conceptions, things like that. So today what I'm going to do is, I've thought about misconceptions and alternative conceptions a lot. I'm going to present my research on uncovering and understanding alternative conceptions about how vaccines work. So this is work I did with a master's student. Actually, this is a pretty big paper, but I'm going to focus on how we uncovered alternative conceptions among our students and asked whether, to what extent these conceptions impede acquiring accurate knowledge. And then we're going to transition into a discussion of how you can find alternative conceptions that your students hold. Okay. So my study was done public West Coast master granting institution, racially pretty diverse population in terms of racially, gender, first gen. And I do want to say all my data was collected before the pandemic. When it comes to vaccines, there's been a lot of evidence that everything about the COVID vaccine has like highly politicized ideas about vaccines. And so unfortunately, some of the misconceptions and some of these ideas people hold now might be different. But I still think it's valuable to show what kind of as a framework for uncovering what students know and don't know, and for kind of adding some potential misconceptions to the literature. I will say too, this was a pretty big study. So I had 4 student groups that I was looking at these misconceptions in. And I was looking for group differences, which I'm happy to talk about in more detail if you're curious. So I was looking among, these are all people taking some sort of bio class. So there were people taking classes for non-majors, and some of them were just non-majors. Communications majors, whatever majors. Others were pre-health majors, pre-nursing or pre-PT majors. I also had intro biology and advanced biology majors, and I also had bio faculty as an expert control because I didn't think, if our bio faculty didn't answer a certain way, I didn't feel that it was fair to ask our students to do it. So that just served as an expert control. What would an expert say? And so, yeah, I was curious about what alternative conceptions students had about how vaccines work. So a good place to start when thinking about alternative conceptions about your topic is in previous literature, right? So there's definitely been research on alternative conceptions, but it's concentrated on certain topics. So like if you're teaching mechanics, like first year physics, there's been a lot done on that. If you're teaching evolution, there's been a lot done on that. Other topics, not so much. So my upper division course is cellular neuroscience. There hasn't been as much done there. So I look to my own students. I look to what they say on exams, in office hours, things like that. For other topics like vaccines, there's almost been too much previous research. And what do I mean by that? Well, because this has been such a relevant thing. Like there have been a ton of people going around, not only students, but the general population, asking them all sorts of questions about vaccines and uncovering all sorts of interesting ideas. And of course, for something like vaccines, if you go on Facebook, a lot of people will volunteer all sorts of wrong ideas, all on their own volition. And so that should be good, right? But the thing is, if you look at some of these, it really made me wonder how much was relevant for my population. So for example, there was a very popular vaccine knowledge scale in use when I was starting this project, developed by Zing and Segrist. And this this is their items here. I know it's small, but basically it's a bunch of misconceptions, documented misconceptions. Diseases like autism might be triggered through vaccinations. The immune system of children might be overloaded by vaccination, things like that. And so the thing is, like, this checklist, I mean, correlates well with certain other like anti-vaccine attitudes and stuff, but it was developed in like German moms. How relevant is that to my students in a very different population who actually for the most part were not parents? I did ask that question as well. So what I thought is that I would not take this kind of like existing checklist based approach and instead try to uncover alternative conceptions myself. And by asking basically the students what they thought. So if you want to measure what students think and you're not quite sure what they'll say, the best way is always just ask them. Ask them to explain stuff in their own words, to use open-ended questions and get them to say stuff. And so if you want students to be honest, right, you have to make it low stakes. Mine was no stakes. So they knew it was part of a research project. And I made a point to assure students that whatever they put down is okay. Even if they feel like they don't know, anything they put down is okay. They probably have some ideas coming from somewhere, from, what they've heard, what they've learned before, or even just living in their own bodies and seeing things happen. So yeah, just asking open-ended questions and letting kind of the students share their ideas with themselves. And so my exact prompt was this: if asked by another student in your major, how would you respond to the following question? How does a vaccine work? So very simple, but there's a lot of room in there to elicit all sorts of diverse ideas. Okay, so so the students wrote a whole bunch of stuff, right? We have hundreds of students writing a whole bunch of different steps. Well, how did we analyze that? So basically what we did is we read through them. We first read through a small list and we came up with kind of some common ideas. What were some ideas that we kept seeing over and over again? And this was our kind of core list of alternative conceptions. And then what we did to kind of validate that and to quantify the frequency of these misconceptions, she trained another research student to recognize these misconceptions or these alternative conceptions, and they read new responses until they were both in agreement more than 90% of the time. And then we also, because we were doing this for research, we wanted to make really sure that our alternative ideas really were wrong. And so we went and we looked to see that none of the bio faculty said any of these wrong ideas. And then we also asked actual immunologists whether these ideas were clearly inaccurate. So that was a help to us too, to kind of refine our language. Okay. So what kinds of things did people say? I wanted to share some of that with you. So these are 3 responses from 3 different students. So I think what would be good is if we could all just take a moment, read over these responses and just kind of think to yourself, what ideas do you see here? So I'll give you a minute to do that. I think what we'll do is a waterfall type thing. So what ideas do you see? If you could type in an idea you see, one or more ideas that you see in these responses, just kind of type it, but don't press enter yet, and I will let you know when to press enter. Does that make sense? All right, so go ahead and type, but don't press enter yet. Are people ready? Are they still typing? People are ready? Okay. All right. All right, everybody. When I get to 0, so 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0, enter. Okay, yeah, great. So lots of different responses here. So vaccine is a concentrated virus. That's an interesting idea. Yeah, there's a wide range in what the students are saying. Vaccines prevent illness of some sort. Other students are saying like that the experience of getting a shot, getting a vaccine. Maybe the second student misunderstood the problem, but maybe that's just what they know. Yeah, other ideas that vaccines are artificial. There's correct, incorrect ideas mixed together. The vaccine has the virus. Yeah, and they're talking about injections. So yeah, so there's some relation to accurate ideas, but there's also some relation to inaccurate ideas. And so that's what struck us as well, is that that interplay there. So if we just look at the first one has actually a lot of good details. What do they know? So they know that when you get a vaccine, your immune system is activated, right? Where your white blood cells and your T cells are doing something. They're somehow being trained to combat that virus, that it's used in the future. They know that it's pathogen-like, right? So one of the major ideas about vaccines, why they work, is that they somehow resemble the pathogen. So this person knows that. But there is also these inaccurate factors, like putting aside the very kind of anthropomorphic language, which we found actually in a lot of our faculty responses as well. So we didn't really consider that. But aside from that, the idea about this concentrated virus, so this person thinks the actual virus is in the vaccine, and that's just not true. And I want to contrast that with the second person, who, there's nothing wrong there. But there's really not many ideas there that, like, they're not really telling you how vaccines work. They're telling how they're administered, but they're not telling you how vaccines work. And so what we ended up doing actually is making 2 rubrics, one for accurate knowledge, and then it's not really a rubric, we made a list of alternative conceptions. And so the rubric for accurate knowledge, which we also kind of cross-checked with what the CDC says for the general public about vaccines and stuff, had these 3 components. One is pathogen likeness. A vaccine contains something that is shaped like the pathogen, or is part of a pathogen, or is a modified pathogen, something like that. It's pathogen-like. And the second part is immune activation, right? So vaccines stimulate the immune system. So another example is the immune system detects the vaccine, starts making white blood cells and antibodies to combat it. And then the third is prevention. So vaccines function mostly to prevent disease or lessen its severity in the future. As opposed to, there were students who are like, oh, you get sick and then you get a vaccine. For the vast majority of vaccines, right? That's not how you do it. It's for preventing future disease. And then we also tallied up alternative conceptions, and to my surprise, we weren't getting a lot of the like weird things that are online, or the things that make people angry online. You know, the most common misconception we found is the one that that first student had, that the vaccines contain like the pathogen in unmodified form. So like, you know, a lot of students said stuff like, oh, it's a cocktail of different things, including whatever virus it's meant to protect you from, like the virus. That was by far the most common. Another one are that idea that vaccines are primarily a treatment or a cure. So, oh, it even helps to clean out an infection you might already have. By the way, like some students thought it was both, like it could be both preventative and like a treatment. So it's not necessarily that, see, they can hold correct and incorrect ideas simultaneously. And then these were a little more rare. The vaccine doesn't work through the immune system. It like directly harms or fights the pathogen. So some people thought they were like antibodies, or but something to say that, oh, it directly fights the disease, like maybe an antibiotic would. Vaccines are mainly injected directly into the bloodstream rather than through a muscle. This one was a advanced bio major. You know, it's injected through a vein and it goes through the vena cava and the aorta, and you know, very fancy language, but the basic concept is not right. And then finally, a single vaccine provides immunity to all pathogens or diseases. So the vaccine takes over the body so that no other known disease can take over the body. So yeah, these were the most common ones that we found, and a number of these, like these last three, were actually, as far as we can tell, kind of novel in the literature, at least. Okay, so we have alternative conceptions, students who have alternative conceptions, and I will say there were people with other alternative conceptions, just not very common ones. Okay, so now we were also looking at the relationship between alternative conceptions and accurate knowledge. So going back to this rubric, we gave each student a basic knowledge score by adding up how many of these things that they wrote in their response. So let me ask you, do students with inaccurate ideas have have worse basic knowledge scores? And so I'm going to share a poll. Are people seeing that? Go ahead and click in. By the way, how are we doing on time? I can't see that on my computer.
We have about 22 minutes.
Thank you. All right, I see about 2/3 of you have participated. Any more takers? Okay. Great, I'm gonna pause it there. So let's see, most of you didn't think they had higher, and then many of you thought that it wasn't significantly different. Other people thought it would be lower. Okay. So it turns out that students with inaccurate ideas do, on average, have worse basic knowledge scores. So this is students on the left here. Those are students with any inaccuracies, like not necessarily one of the top 5, any inaccuracies, versus students who are entirely accurate. And by the way, the students with, you can see here, the students with at least one inaccuracy, that was the majority of the group. And yeah, you could see here that on average, they had worse basic knowledge scores. So the darker the color means kind of the lower the knowledge score there. So that was a pretty significant difference. So on average, students with inaccurate ideas also have worse basic knowledge. But thinking about those individual alternative conceptions, is that true for every one of them? Is each one of them individually, are they associated with lower basic knowledge scores? What do you think? So I have another poll. Can you all see that? Does that question make sense? All right, go ahead. All right. All right, I'm going to pause here. So I'm going to go ahead and share the results. So sounds like many of you think some are, but some have no association. So that seems to be the dominant answer. So you want to see? All right. So it turns out that it just depends. So what does this table mean? So what I did to investigate this question is I performed a regression analysis with model selection to kind of predict the effect of having each of the inaccurate ideas on basic knowledge scores. And so for some of them, I did find that they were associated with lower. So the idea that the vaccines or treatment or cure, those folks scored much less well. If all else were equal, those folks would score much lower. The idea that vaccines directly fight the pathogen and the idea that there's a single vaccine for all disease, those are all associated with significantly lower basic knowledge scores. This idea that vaccines are injected directly into the bloodstream seem to have no effect. It was actually not in the final model, which is why I don't have a p-value or anything on there. So whether you believe that or not didn't seem to have any sort of relationship between how much basic knowledge you knew. And then finally, what I thought interesting was that this idea that the vaccine has an unmodified pathogen was actually associated with a significantly higher basic knowledge score. Now, the thing is, you might be like, well, that's a little unfair, because if you know it's the unmodified pathogen, you kind of automatically know that it's pathogen-like, because pathogens are similar to themselves, right? But actually, when you looked at the other factors, the saying that the vaccine was an unmodified pathogen was also associated with a higher probability of knowing that the immune system was activated and that that vaccines are preventative, that they prevent future disease. So I think this is an example of a misconception that people kind of get to, maybe from not quite understanding what they've been taught, or maybe through logic. I mean, it is logical that if the vaccine has the pathogen itself, right, that it would activate the immune system like the real virus would, or the real pathogen would, and that you do that in order to prevent worse disease later. So some combination of not quite understanding, but using logic to try to figure things out. And so I think that is something that you can work with as a teacher, right? If you give a prompt like this and you find a lot of people are saying things that are really wrong, right? That vaccines are treatments, that they work by fighting the pathogen directly, or that one vaccine will combat everything. I mean, to me, that shows that you have to start with a more basic place with your students and work with them more to get them to understanding. But if you have a lot of students who are up here who think it's the unmodified pathogen, a lot of the groundwork for understanding vaccines is in place. It's just getting across that idea that it's not the pathogen itself, but a modified version of it, a part of it, something that won't make you actually sick. And once they understand that, that'll be good. Okay, so in summary, when I gave this very open-ended question, students revealed a lot of diverse ideas, both accurate and inaccurate. Most of these inaccurate ideas turned out to be negatively associated with accurate knowledge, but some had no effect and some had a positive association. And this information lets us know which alternative ideas to focus on and how. Okay. So finally, I want you to think about this in your own context. So let's take a few minutes to either think or write down what's a topic you feel that your students frequently have inaccurate ideas about, and what's a prompt that you could use to find out what those alternative conceptions are. And my tips are keep it very open-ended, right? Like ask how, why, what. Students should have to explain something, right? There should be room for lots of different kinds of ideas to come out. And the other thing is like when you're giving it, kind of approach it in the spirit of curiosity, not judgment. Like students can tell, right? You can tell when people are judging you. And then that shuts down their ideas. So, all right, so let's all just take a minute or two to think about that and to come up with a tentative prompt. How are people doing with their prompts? Give you a couple more seconds. Well, I'll do this. I'll kind of yeah, it's hard. Um, so let me just kind of explain the direction for the breakout rooms, and you can kind of finish up while I do that. So in your breakout rooms, I'm going to put people in groups of 4. Go ahead and introduce yourself with your name, your discipline, and the topic that your students have misconceptions about. And then, yeah, share the prompts with the other people after you all introduce yourself, and see what they say. And I do want to say, like, no judgment, right? Like people here from different disciplines. Maybe you didn't realize that chemistry thing was a misconception. Don't worry about it. Just answer honestly. And then after everyone has shared their prompt, if there's extra time, you can kind of workshop your prompts, talk about what makes a good prompt or a bad prompt. Is that all good? All right, I am going to open up the breakout rooms now.
Do we want to share how much time in the breakout rooms? Or,
Uh,
because
how
we're at
much?
about 1:49. We end around 2, so
Okay.
maybe 10 minutes.
Yeah, 10 minutes.
Does that sound good?
Yeah, so I'm going to create 5 breakout rooms then. All right, go ahead and join. It looks like all the rooms have at least 3. So that's good. Do you think I should jump around, or you're muted?
You want to ask folks for their insights from the breakout room once we have everyone back.
I think they all closed, yeah.
I think everyone's
Um,
back, yeah.
yeah, so I just wanted to ask in general, what did you notice about what prompts worked well to elicit diverse ideas? And so you could put it in chat, or you could just talk or raise your hand. Okay. Or what were some observations that you had in general? Oh, Trevor, go ahead.
Yeah, I think I enjoyed all of the prompts that we had in our group. I thought they were they're very different, which was fun. I think what I think all of them, let's say, diverse ideas in that they had the option to have something like that. They had a kind of obvious-ish answer for someone who didn't know anything, which I fell into for at least a couple of them. They had a like another kind of, you could give a superficial answer, and then there was a lot of depth that you could, depending on where you were and knowing things, you could answer it in a lot of different ways. And then there probably were also a lot of ways to have misconceptions or alternative conceptions come up.
Thank you. So Robin said in the chat, we had a good discussion about how general or specific the prompts should be. So Robin, do you or does anyone in that group want to kind of elaborate on that?
Sure. But I'll say a few things, but let everybody else jump in too. We just debated back and forth. You know, if you make the question very specific to what you think, it basically implies that you think you know what the misconception is going to be, right? So you hone in on the thing that you suspect they're all tripping over. And yes, that's advantageous because then it allows you to really dig deeper into why they think that way and what alternative ideas they have around that misconception. But you might potentially miss some other misconception that they have. That was what we talked about.
Yeah, I totally agree. And like I did not see the kinds of responses that I thought I would see. Like those were not the most common misconceptions that I thought were the most common. So yeah, I think there's a lot to be said for letting yourself be surprised.
Mm-hmm.
I think Annie wanted to share as well. I saw Annie had her hand up.
We were talking about how broad and how specific to make the prompts. And then also, I was curious to know like what you expected to do with the answers once you got them.
That's a great question. Yeah. So, I mean, I okay. What I do for research and what I do for like my own teaching are different. When I do that for my own teaching, I kind of make a note of it. I'm explicit about it to the students. You know, I'll say things like, this was an idea that I saw a lot. Let's think about it. And maybe I'll be teaching accurate knowledge, right? I'll be teaching the material, in other words. And then I'll present something like, you know, this was an idea that a lot of people had. Knowing what you know now, what do you think about it? And that might be a clicker, it might be a discussion question, something like that. So I try to use that to kind of inform my teaching. I mean, ideally that quarter. Sometimes it doesn't happen until, you know, the next quarter. But yeah, I bring them to the students and ask them to kind of to challenge them. Well, any other questions or ideas? Thank you. Yeah, I think it's getting close to the time, huh?
So I think, yeah, we're at about 2:05 right now.
Okay.
So thank you. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you for all. I just want to say, I want to give credit to my master's student, Gavina, and my other master's student, Freshta. I want to thank, you know, all the participants, all the faculty, Kimberly, who let me do this project, even though it wasn't the thing I was hired to do. And then also my good colleagues at UCSD. And thank you all for choosing to spend time with me today. I do have a couple minutes in case you have more questions, but I know a lot of folks have to go. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Melinda. Really wonderful to hear this. And again, I think if folks want to stick around to discuss more or ask questions, please feel free to stay. Otherwise, we understand if you have to leave. And we hope to see you at the next NIST Falcon session in 2 weeks.